and I think that it can work. But why should the government become a partner in these programs? You know, they say that, well, we have a role because our role is to get people to use less of this or that. Realistically, the marketplace is going to make a lot of the determinations, and the more you create an artificial market, the more you're really going to be destroying. First, you're going to be destroying the very basics of capitalism, which you need to function in the society that we live. And then the second thing is that by creating artificial markets, you never really know whether a program is successful or not, because if you're subsidizing it, how can you? And then you have the problems that you're in bed with business. I mean, I can think back to the '94 platform where I clearly said the worst thing for Rhode Island is to be in business with what they're trying to regulate, because then you start bending your rules because it's hurting your game. I mean, the example of smoking at the casinos. Mm-hmm. So it's just not a good idea, by and large, if that's where we're going with this conversation.
Well, and on top of that, Jorge Lorz's campaign is talking about a revolving loan fund, despite the fact that we were fined federally. The federales came in on the province economic development.
I mean, you have payback issues, you have who the loans are going to issues, you have corruption issues in government. If you put the Pope in charge of it, maybe you would have, some reasonable or some modicum of success and stuff. But, what you have is you have people that are running the programs who may or may not be loyal to certain business groups, certain special interests. I mean, we're human. We have to have friends and contacts. But when they start to influence government, and when government is given the position to make those possible, that's dangerous.
There are many states that employ successful economic development commissions. Now, you're an attorney and you've run real businesses, and as I said, you've had to make payroll. It strikes me that the government's involvement in business formation should be restricted to that of an advisory role. The Utah, for example, years ago I worked for a small startup out of Salt Lake City, and the Utah Economic Development Commission provided free legal help. Mm-hmm. They explained blue sky laws in terms of capital acquisition. They had tax people on staff who could explain tax implications. Mm-hmm. It was a real collegial relationship with business, but at no point was I aware that there was any money to be had from anywhere. They were there to help, to nurture, to foster, to serve as kind of a back office incubator.
Right. I mean, again, back to '94, 20 years ago. I keep saying these ideas, and people have a tendency to forget them. But I advocated that Rhode Island people in Rhode Island should have the right to go once every 10 years. If you're a Rhode Island resident, once every 10 years, you should have the right to just go and incorporate a business for free. Mm-hmm. One, you encourage business. Two, it encourages the cooperation. But the third thing that you have in Rhode Island, which is, we have this thing where, wow, look, we're growing a lot of small businesses. And I thought about that for the longest time. I said, wow, how can this be? We've got this enterprising state, and and yet we're not functioning right. And then I realized people aren't getting into business because they have an entrepreneurial spirit. They're getting into these businesses, small businesses, because they don't have a job somewhere else, and They have a skill that they can possibly use to feed their families. Mm-hmm. And when you look at it that way, you say, wow, we're not really doing that well. We're doing worse than we thought, as opposed to better, because people are just trying to get by. So I don't think indicators and social indicators and numbers that are provided by government studies are necessarily telling of the true and accurate picture that you have. What we have to do is similar to what you suggested was going on in Utah. I mean, we have to make it friendly. We have to make it a situation where people can access the government for the purposes that the government is there, to provide information, to dutifully do the jobs, to keep the records, not to necessarily get engaged in a business.
The only industry that seems to be left in the state, and there's very little of it. I'm intrigued by the notion that there's this obsession with cutting the top corporate tax rate, a rate that I contend very few, if any, people actually pay.
Right.
We're cutting a rate that is meaningless.
It's immaterial.
Yeah. my contention is that Stenhouse and his group have done yeoman's work on analyzing consumption taxes.
I think I don't blindly rely on that, but I think his information is very good.
Right. So if there was ever a case of, let's say, break glass and pull trigger, it would appear to me that significantly lowering the state sales tax would be one quick way to jumpstart.
It would be an interesting way of attempting to solve a problem, and you'd have at least some novel approach. I mean, even if you move, I mean, the argument kind of is formulated in a weird fashion. They say, okay, the 1% or 2% more that you have in certain taxes, I mean, people go over the border and buy.
Right.
Well, if that's the mentality, and you've recognized that, and you can prove that that's the mentality of the people of your state leaving to go purchase in another state, bring yours down under the other state.
Yeah.
Then they'll come over, and, you know, I mean, and I think I explained it. I said, look, if you have, you know, an 8, just for numbers, I said, you know, if you're taxing at 8%, okay, for every $100 spent, you're going to get, excuse me, I did 7%. No, I did in my example, 7%. If you tax at 7%, like Rhode Island does, you come over, spend $100, $7 goes to the state. Okay, you cut it to $4, which is lower than your neighboring state. Mm-hmm. You get all the neighboring business. As long as they come in and spend the same amount of money, you're actually ahead. Because if they come in and spend $100 and they give the state $4, and your people still spend the $100 in state, or even spend more because they're in state, that's $8 instead of $7. You're doing it in volume as opposed to doing it in high taxation.
Well, I mean, ultimately,
I don't know if that translates on the radio, but if you write it down on a piece of paper.
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, and one only has to look at the behavior of business. Why are the retail corridors in Seekonk and North Attleboro so powerful?
Yeah. And
yet one needs only go over the border to see financial desolation.
Right.
I mean, you don't see a powerhouse retail community. I spoke yesterday with a wonderful woman who owns a retail business in Warren. You don't see, however, that kind of dynamic shopping influx into Warren. You don't see it in Cumberland.
Right.
You certainly don't see it in the Bucket.
Right.
It doesn't exist. And that's why they're perched on the border. As the analogy I always draw is like a bad toilet bowl ring. I mean, they're out there waiting right over the border. Lower property taxes, lower sales taxes. You know, isn't that obvious enough?
It's pretty obvious. I don't know whether it's recognized, but it's obvious. It's blatant.
Yeah, it's so one has to ask, at what point is when, you know, your opponent, I call her, back in the day I called her Good Gina. There's Good Gina and Bad Gina. Good Gina, when she was doing pension reform, talked about it's just the math. You know, it's really, that's all it is, isn't it? It's about the math.
Oh, for a business mind, yeah.
Absolutely. The while we're on Rhode Island Commerce, 38 studios. I'm astonished, and this was discussed on Matt Allen's show the other day on AM 630, the sister station here, what a non-factor that appears to be in this election.
It is and it isn't. I mean, it's being minimized, that's for sure. I mean, the exact role of anybody playing into it is the issue. I mean, the payments are, I mean, all you have left is the crying, really. And if you're either going to make the payments or you're not at this point. My position is not. I don't think we as the public have seen enough information to even fathom a guess as to whether or not it's right or wrong to repay. I don't fear a lowered bond rating. And quite frankly, I think it would make the cost of borrowing higher, and therefore we do less of it. So I think that might be a better a benefit, actually, to, you know.
Well, I mean, Michael Riley, who's a regular guest on our show and call-in, and he appeared with us a few weeks ago, pointed out rather adroitly that if Rhode Island general obligation bonds were to all of a sudden take a drop in value, you would see a rush by Wall Street to buy them. Right. You know, you'd see a line at the border because they are secured by the full faith and obligation of the state of Rhode Island.
I mean, and a moral obligation is a moral obligation, and and to be honest with you, I find it. I mean, the pension stuff is still in the courts, so it's not even a fait accompli. So to think that, you know, we have reform pension is a whole, I think, a fallacy. The idea that we can find a moral obligation to people who are investors and came in at risk, and yet we can't find a moral obligation to the pension people, I think that is just an outrage. Yeah, I don't like to pay bills as much as the next guy, but we elected stupid people to the legislature who gave things away. We have, what's right is right as far as I'm concerned. I'm not advocating that we have to go out and withdraw all lawsuits, but think about it this way. We do have, if we have a moral obligation to Wall Street, we have a moral obligation to our people, whether it's sitting down and negotiating it out or whether it's dealing with the problem in one way or another. But we have that moral obligation to those people as much or more. I mean, they worked in our state. They live in our state. We can pay, off to people who aren't even caring about what Rhode Island is. And yet, we can't find a moral obligation in the other areas. I find that to be so disingenuous.
As part of your early campaign announcements, if you will,
mm-hmm.
you brought up what I call the scarlet letter in Rhode Island.
Uh-oh.
I'm not talking adultery. I'm not talking abortion. I'm talking austerity.
Dun, dun, dun.
There you go. A word I think, if one could have monitored internet traffic, I would think you would have seen a significant bump to dictionary.com, because I'm not sure if most of the state even knows what that word means. I was driving. I almost drove off the road. I think I'm surprised that wasn't considered an obscenity in this state by the FCC. The state of Rhode Island, and again, getting back to it's the math,
mm-hmm.
a state where you've got, experts on poverty like Linda, whatever, from the whatever economic casualties of war, whatever they're calling themselves this year, where poverty people routinely make six-figure salaries, where people who are chief of staff to the president of the Senate make $175,000 a year, where the shrimp and the Pernod bill for the General Assembly is probably well into six figures. Are they capable of austerity, or will be forced on them?
I think it's going to be forced on them. I don't think that they think like that. I think it's. I mean, they're holding the strings to the public purse, and they're disseminating money like it's water, and that's just going to come back. I mean, you can only do it for so long. I mean, you can't do it in your house. You can't do it in your business. You most certainly won't be able to do it in government, and that's the bottom line. I think that the belt tightening, in a logical, thought out fashion, is going to be far better than a belt tightening by restrictions and what have you. I think just a little bit of forethought, and a little bit of saving, and a little bit of scrimping, and a little bit of cutting things that you don't necessarily. I advocate that there's probably 1% to 2% waste in the budget,
mm-hmm.
maybe more. But you're looking at $200 million, just in that alone, and I mean, but then again, I run. I tilt at windmills. I was looking at the office of Lieutenant Governor and saying, we're wasting $1 million a year. Half of the people, more than half of the people, didn't care.
Right.
I mean, they just didn't care. I mean, here was a no-brainer. I'm going to work for nothing. We're going to put $1 million back into the Treasury. I got 40% of the vote. 40%, which is,
which was great.
I got more votes than the governor.
Right.
But that doesn't win elections. It doesn't get your ideas into. I mean, they're out there, and I'm glad that Tony and even Bill Gilbert and a few other people are pushing it, and everybody who's running for lieutenant governor is trying to poo-poo the issue. But the reality comes down to, in the last, I think we were doing well, except for we were running a traditional low-budget campaign, and my opponent came in and the last minute spent $500,000 or so putting on some really negative ads,
mm-hmm.
and negative ads work. I mean, it's tried and true. I mean, it's the business of politics.
Well, speaking of negative, we had a show on a few weeks ago where we had Justice Flanders, we had mayoral candidate Harp, mm-hmm. and again, regular guest Mike Riley on. We were talking about, as opposed to the A word, the B word,
mm-hmm.
bankruptcy. You've got a burn rate, and for folks not in the financial community or people like me who are not experts, we just play one on the radio. You talk about the burn rate. The burn rate is essentially the excess spending that's
mm-hmm.
occurring in any governmental organization,
sure.
above and beyond revenue collection. And nowhere is that more the case than in a number of these underfunded pension systems.
Correct.
As governor, if we lose, first of all, if this case is lost,
which if you look at article, I mean, I have a go ahead.
No, I mean.